Good afternoon, everyone. I am going to put a QR code and a link in the chat. It is for a survey for demographic purposes. This lecture is part of a grant, and so we need to collect information on the participants. So if each and every one of you could click on that link or scan the QR code and complete that, that would be great. You don't have to wait till the end of the lecture to complete it. You can complete it as soon as I put the link in there. And Dr. Samford, thank you for presenting today, and you are welcome to begin whenever you are ready.
Thank you very much. My name is Angela Samford, and I'm a professor of internal medicine in the Division of Geriatrics at St. Louis University. I'm presenting on the aging bias today, and I'm really thankful for this opportunity to present this topic. It's kind of been one as a geriatrician that's been near and dear to my heart since I started practice. I think I wrote many parts of it in the shower over the years. That's where I kind of think through a lot of my lecture topics and such. So I finally was able to put it down on paper. My only disclosure is I just finished clinic, and so I didn't have time to go to my office, so I'm in a clinic room, so hopefully no one bothers me. I told them I was giving a lecture, but just in case. Um, so I have no real disclosures. And then I wanted to dedicate this lecture to my grandparents. They were really influential to me in my career choice. Only one of them, the one that is in the wedding picture, was lived long enough to see me become a geriatrician. I think when you have grandparents who are really instrumental in your life, a lot of times you have ability to see the beauty in aging. And so when, most of us geriatricians have someone like that in our life that was influential to us when we chose our career. So today we'll explore the concept of ageism and how deeply rooted this bias is in each one of us. We'll compare and contrast the aging experience of the Western culture versus other cultures. We'll talk about the impact of ageism in the workplace and also in the healthcare setting. And then we'll brainstorm on ways in which we can change the ageism narrative within ourselves and our surrounding culture. So, one of my first thoughts was, how many of you have experienced ageism? I know a lot of you are probably younger, but just because you're younger, there's ageism when you're young as well as ageism when you're old. I took this picture that says elderly parking only when I was on a Girl Scout outing. I was driving for this Girl Scout outing and we were at a restaurant and they actually had the elderly parking only. So I told all the Girl Scouts in the car that it's not really politically correct anymore to use the term elderly and that we prefer to use older adults. But it was the first time I'd ever seen a picture like this. But if we were in the live audience, I'd have you all unmute and or talk and talk about how you're experienced ageism. So just be thinking about that. So I wanted to start with a little quiz. True or false? There is an ICD-10 code for old age. The answer is actually true, and the code is senility not otherwise specified. And then also there is an old age code as well. What percentage of older adults do you think live in nursing homes in the US? So these are your choices. A, 10 to 15%, B, 2 to 4%, C, 5 to 8%, or D, 15 to 20%. I think I would have guessed probably C. I do nursing home work the majority of my work week actually, and I tend to think a lot of people live in nursing homes. The actual answer is B, though, 2 to 4%. About 4% of older adults live in nursing homes in the US, and 2% live in assisted living facilities. So it was less than I thought. And the last quiz question, true or false? Successful aging is the responsibility of the individual. That's kind of a loaded question. I would say it's a trick question. I think there's other factors that contribute, genetics, environment, and then there are social and societal factors. So maybe not completely the responsibility of the individual. So have you ever thought, oh no, this 90-year-old on my schedule is going to slow me down. All these old people do is complain. The car in front of me is going so slow, it must be an old man. He shouldn't be driving. That elderly checker at Target takes so long to ring up our purchases. Let's go to the 20-year-old in checkout lane 3. OMG, is that old lady really using a check to pay at Walgreens? Why doesn't she get a debit card? Where are her kids to help her get with the technology? So all of these were my secret thoughts. When I was working on this lecture, I also had to look at my biases. And I sat down and I thought, these are all things I thought in the last week. It's true, the elderly checker at Target, her name is Nancy, and me and the kids know to avoid her. We always go to another one because she does take a long time. And I remembered the road I was driving down where I was thinking, oh my gosh, this man is so old and he's going so slow, I can't get around him. And so I think I wanted to use this to highlight that I'm a geriatrician and I still have these deeply rooted ageist bias. And so I think we probably all have them. And if this lecture does anything, I'd like for you to challenge your beliefs or, challenge your thoughts and recognize these biases in yourself. So I'd like to challenge also everything we know about aging. So from a young age, our developing brains are filled with images and stories and songs that encourage fears of being old. So think about the bedtime stories that we grew up hearing or that we read to our children. Think about the characters in them. Usually they're older people and they're ugly, they're scary, they're feeble. In elementary school, we celebrate the 100th day of school by dressing like humpback 100-year-olds. So all of us that are on Facebook that are friends with moms, that are people having children, know around the time when the 100th day of school happens because we all see pictures. And the thought doesn't really cross our mind that this might be degrading or, derogatory, but if you really sit and think about what we're having our kids dress up like, it's probably not a very good image of the aging process for them. Young women are the primary targets for anti-aging cosmetics. And there's just this pervasive message in society that it's never too soon or, you're never early enough to fight the aging process. I think we're also conditioned to equate any amount of dependence as a failure. And it used to not be that way in society. But we have these cultural messages that present caregiving as a burden that leads to burnout instead of a natural or normal part of human relationships. I mean, think about raising children. We don't, think about it as an adult as being a burden to raise children. That's just expected. But the opposite's also expected. We should view taking care of those who took care of us as just part of the natural, relationship cycle. So why are old women often the face of evil in fairy tales and folklore? So if you go around kind of in a clockwise way, on the left you've got the witch in Snow White who's wanting to poison Snow White with an apple. And then the next to her, you've got the old lady in Hansel and Gretel who's trying to catch children, cook them in an oven, and eat them. And that's a common bedtime story. And then at the top right up there is Cruella de Vil, who likes to steal Dalmatian puppies from children. And then we've got on the bottom there, we've got Ursula, who tries to rip out Ariel's voice box so that she herself can have a youthful singing voice. And then on the bottom right, there is the old hag that locks up Rapunzel in a tower and uses her hair to stay eternally youthful. So these are pretty common fairy tales most of our children know. And that's sort of the message we're portraying about aging and getting older and older women to them. So a study that was done at the University of Michigan that included over 2,000 older adults aged 50 to 80 looked at the prevalence of everyday ageism. So they created this everyday ageism scale that included 10 items across 3 dimensions. And what they found is about 82% of older adults experience ageism every day. About 65% report exposure to ageist messages, like through ads or greeting cards or commercials on a daily basis. And also a high percentage experienced internalized ageism, which is ageism that means that they felt sad or worried or lonely, and that this was just part of the aging process. They should just accept these feelings as, well, I'm getting older, so that's just how things are. Here, sorry. Ageism studies have been conducted across 45 countries. And ageism was interestingly observed in all 45 countries that the studies were done in. And in general, there tends to be associations between ageism and health outcomes, and they're stronger in less developed countries versus more developed countries, which is sort of counterintuitive. But what happens in less developed countries, there tends to be less resources to take care of older adults. And so that's why there tends to be a worse outcome. And then also those with lower education, countries that have lower education levels or less developed education systems tend to have stronger associations between ageism and health outcomes. So there's a steadily increasing interest in conducting research on ageism, and probably partially the increasing prevalence is due to this increased awareness. And we can look at ageism on both the structural level and individual level, and we'll kind of talk about this in the upcoming slides. So I wanted to share this video. These are three of my children. When I was working on this lecture, I was talking to one of my older colleagues about kind of what I was finding, and she told me that the new generation calls older people boomers, and I had never heard that word before. So it wasn't really long after the conversation that I was trying to set up a smart TV at home we had just bought, and I was failing because it was definitely smarter than me. And one of my kids said, "Mom, you're such a boomer." And so I asked them what that meant, and I wanted to play this for you. I heard my children using the word boomer, and I inquired as to what this may be. All right, Blaze. Blaze is 12 years old. What is a boomer?
A boomer is someone who doesn't know anything about like the new culture, I guess. New culture, yeah.
All right, Cecilia is 11. What is a boomer?
A boomer is a person who's boring.
Sam is 9. What is a boomer?
A boomer is an old person who doesn't really know how to do anything.
Great. And their mom is a geriatrician. So I realized in my own family, I had not done a good job if my kids were calling me a boomer and with their message of what a boomer is. So I set to work on them too. Oops. There tends, in general, to be a pervasive message of younger is better, or younger is good, and older is bad. But if you sort of dissect that and think about it, being young or old are not good or bad. They just are. That's just part of our natural life cycle. So it's not a good or a bad thing. So when we're talking about different aging models, there's three different aging models. One is the biological aging model. It's also your physiological age, or the other term for it is senescence. And this is an aging model that's based on the age of your cells and kind of looks at aging as a process that leads to gradual deterioration of a function in your cells and or organisms in general. And they can even break it down to the cellular level. So aging at the cellular level is caused by telomere damage, epigenetic dysregulation, DNA damage, mitochondrial dysfunction, which leads to senescence, and then that leads to stem cell exhaustion and chronic inflammation and sort of a repeating cycle. So the biological aging model reflects how our body and brain show the physical effects of aging, and it's really kind of a one-sided view based on decline. And then you have the chronological aging model, which is basically how old are you based on your birthday. It leaves much room for heterogeneity. So what I mean by that is, no two 65-year-olds are exactly the same. So if you're saying someone's old based on their age, maybe one 65-year-old is old and one is not. And then there's the comprehensive person-centered aging model, which really looks at aging as a universal, lifelong, biological, physiological, social, psychological, spiritual process of development that occurs over time. And really looks at aging as a dynamic model that includes all processes at once: growth, loss, maintenance, and adaptation. Sort of looks at it as being multidimensional, multidirectional, and very individualized. And I will say this is definitely the model I like to ascribe to in geriatrics. And really one of my favorite parts of my job is that individualized aging process. No two people in front of me are the same based on their birthday. Excuse me. I'm kind of getting over a cold here. So when we're talking about ageism, it was a term coined first by Robert Butler in, excuse me, 1969. And ageism is defined by the World Health Organization as a stereotype, a prejudice, and or a discrimination towards others or oneself that's based on age. So stereotypes really are distorted or simplified beliefs that attribute characteristics to members of specific groups. So they're lumping people together without acknowledging individual differences. So one example of an ageist stereotype is all older people are frail or helpless. Excuse me. A prejudice is a judgment that's formed without sufficient knowledge or thoughts or reasons and can result from stereotyping. So an example here of an ageist prejudice, it would be old people don't contribute to society and just drain our resources. And then there's discrimination. So discrimination's an unjustified behavior that's usually towards different groups of people based on identity characteristics. So an example here is an employer refusing to hire a qualified job candidate just because of their age. That would be a discrimination. So ageism can be directed at those who are young or old. It's often the result of unconscious or unintentionally ingrained beliefs that are ingrained in our thought patterns. The aging bias is a preference for or against one certain age group. And really, I think compared to other biases or discriminations, it often goes unchallenged. We've really, I think, made, progress in racism and sexism, but we often don't talk about ageism. There are many biases. So I just put some examples here. Taller people are better leaders. We shouldn't hire that woman because she may become pregnant. That person in a wheelchair must also have cognitive deficits. Women are the weaker sex. Obese people are lazy. So a lot of these we wouldn't accept, in practice. If we heard someone talk like this, we would identify a red flag. But I think some of our aging biases we don't often identify because they're so deeply rooted. So there's explicit ageism and implicit ageism. So the explicit ageism is a result of conscious and intentional thoughts. So it results in overt statements or actions that are purposefully discriminatory. So an example is like, we shouldn't hire him because he's too old to learn how to use our new computer system. So that's explicit ageism. Implicit is very much more subtle. So it's usually unconscious and unintentional. This is where our deeply ingrained subconscious stereotypes and biases come in. Implicit ageism often influences our behavior without awareness. So an example would be a doctor who unconsciously, dismisses an older person's complaint as, they're just getting old. So it's kind of, these are some examples. So interpersonal ageism versus self-directed versus institutional. So there's kind of all these different categories of ageism. I wanted to go around and look at famous octogenarians and nonagenarians because I think one of the ways we challenge our ageist bias that are inside of us are looking at people who have aged successfully and who are very successful as older adults because they don't really fit the norm. They don't fit the stereotype. So normally, if we were in person, I'd have you name all these, but I'll just tell you. So at the top left, going around clockwise, we've got Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She died at 87, and she was very politically active till her death. Then we've got Larry King. He also died at 87, and he was active till he died on the radio and TV. And then Betty White, she died at age 99. When she was 88, she hosted Saturday Night Live. And then we've got Warren Buffett, who is 93 and still, or by now he's probably actually 95 and he's still working because I wrote this about a year and a half ago. And down on the bottom right, B.B. King, he was still touring until his death at age 89. And then we've got the famous Chuck Norris, who now probably is like 86 because when I wrote this, he was 84 and he looks really good to be the age he is and he's still active. And then we've got John Williams. He was a famous composer and he had a career spanning 7 decades. He's one that wrote Jurassic Park and Star Wars. He died at age 92. And then, oh yeah, then sorry, B.B. King is the one on the bottom left. Sorry. I got him and Morgan Freeman turned around, but B.B. King still toured till he died at age 89. So why I care about ageism? The reason I'm bringing this to our attention, and one of the reasons to care, is that it really impacts older adults. It impacts them economically. It impacts their health, their physical health, their mental health, their social well-being. So there's kind of a big downstream effect here. It's bad for overall health and longevity. People that tend to have positive attitudes on aging live longer. One study showed about 7.5 years on average longer lifespan. The stress of ageism can contribute to increased risk of chronic disease, dementia, physical health, and decline. And negative self-perceptions on aging are often lead to beliefs that it's not important to seek medical care. I do hear this in my practice. I thought I was just old, so why come to the doctor? I'm just old, nothing's gonna work, nothing's gonna fix me. And then those people also tend to have poor self-related health, and it's kind of like what comes first, the chicken or the egg. So ageism also contributes to health inequity. both at the structural and individual level. So at the structural level, we have societal institutions that promote these biases against older people through their policies, their practices, and their procedures, and that ultimately lead to discrimination. So an example of this is exclusion of older adults from research studies. Um, it's really interesting about, Parkinson's disease trials. One study looked at Parkinson's disease trials, and they found almost 50% of Parkinson's disease clinical trials excluded older adults. When really, in my head, Parkinson's disease is usually one of older age. But they exclude all those people because they're not deemed healthy enough to participate. So a lot of our trials really aren't applicable to older adults because they're excluded from them.
We're just gonna get stuff and go home.
Whoops.
Oh, can you eat it there?
Yeah. That way we can be home.
Is someone need to mute or? Okay. Another example of how ageism contributes to health inequity is withholding of medical treatments and procedures based on age alone. I think we're getting better in the medical field at this and not necessarily saying this person's 80, we're going to exclude them from getting their colon cancer treated. Instead we say this person's 80, they have a really good functional status. I think they would tolerate treatment, we'll try it. Or this person's 80 and, they're really not walking, they're pretty debilitated, they may not be a good candidate, but we're not excluding on the basis of age alone as much any longer. Ageism at the individual level, what happens there is older people can assimilate negative beliefs about aging from their culture, and this results in a poorer quality of life, overall reduced longevity, and seems to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. So this was a study that looked at the impact of ageism on health of older adults at both the structural and individual levels. It was a systematic review that included over 400 studies. And they found that they looked at these different health domains, 11 different health outcomes. And what they found is that all of the 11 domains were impacted by ageism. Oops. And they looked at stuff like, exclusion from health research, people feeling like their lives were devalued because they were older. They looked at, lack of work opportunities. But anyway, all the 11 domains that they viewed were found to have a significant impact from ageism. Ageism is also bad for business. We'll talk more about this when we look at ageism in the workplace, but it can impact economic output, consumer spending, and workplace environment and industry. Older adults can be kept out of production roles, which limits their ability to make money and can contribute to economic growth. So, how do other cultures view aging? How did we get to this point in the US? So back in the ancient Greek and Roman days, we had this old as diseased model. So it's kind of interesting. They were not very positive in their view of older adults. Old age was conceptualized as a downward slope of decrepitude and loss of the highly prized youth and vigor. Aristotle hypothesized that aging was due to a loss of innate heat. This heat is vital for the function of the soul and the body, and the flame diminishes with age. When the flame is extinguished, one dies. Galen, who was a Roman physician, also viewed it was pretty similar of a view that aging is a gradual loss of function and vitality through the extinction of the body's vital heat and humors, and he thought the body was marked by increased desiccation with age. So on the left there, that Greek vase depicted Jairus, which is the Greek god of old age. Jairus is the Greek basis for the word geriatrics, actually. So he was a lesser god who was granted immortality, but he was not ageless. So as he was immortal, he still aged, and as he aged, he became tinier and more shriveled. As he withered away from age, but didn't die, his lover, who was a more powerful Greek god, was disgusted with his appearance and turned him into a cicada. So there were many other ancient cultures, such as the biblical times, that valued older adults for their experience, their knowledge, and their survival skills. So in the caveman times, older adults who, probably older adult meant age 35 at that point, they knew water sources, they knew which plants were poisonous, they were, really helpful when it came to surviving. So you went to them because you needed their expertise. In the biblical times, long-lived people were regarded as favored by God to fulfill a divine purpose. If you were living that long, it was godly inspired, because you were doing his will. Leviticus says, stand up in the presence of the aged, show respect for the elderly, and revere your God. There are several key characters in the Bible who are very old. So Abraham on the left there, that's him sacrificing his son Isaac. He lived to be 175. And in the middle, you got Adam, Adam and Eve. He lived to be 930 years old. And then on the right there, you've got Noah with Noah and the ark, and he lived to be 950 years old. So Islam also viewed aging, and still does view aging, as something to be glorified. So it's part of Allah's glorification. Muhammad said, whenever one is in the presence of a senile in the tribe, respect him. To have people of old age will increase the mercy and the beneficence of God on him or her, and will expand one's blessings onto him or her. The Quran has a verse that says, treat parents with benevolence. If either or both of them attain old age in your presence, then do not even say to them, or nor reproach them. Always speak to both of them submissively. Eastern cultures also traditionally view older adults as wise and valuable members of the family and society. Elders still tend to remain head of the family and are cared for by extended family within the home. In Asia, nursing homes are not very common at all. So most of the care of older adults is still done by the family. Oftentimes they'll have shrines or altars in the home where photos and mementos are placed of elderly relatives to promote honor. Eastern cultures tend to think aging is natural and shouldn't be resisted. In Confucianism, there's a positive view of aging. Older adults are to be treated with respect and obedience. In Taoism, there's a belief that nothing in the universe, including us, will ever stay the same, and that we must allow our life force of energy to flow and transform. And then in Buddhism, they believe that fragile bodies and minds are sacred and worthy of the greatest kind and care. So how did we get to our Western culture's view? In the West here, we have traditionally been thought of as ageist and undervaluing of older adults. Our culture tends to be more youth-centered and placing value on younger adults rather than older adults. We're kind of driven by these really old Protestant values that tie individual worth with ability to work. So if you're not able to work, you're not as worth as much, and to be an active member of society. So if you think about how this occurred, we've got two big things that happened, the printing press and industrial revolution. So when the printing press development occurred, it made possible for the rapid creation and distribution of written material. So, previous to that, older adults were sort of, the living encyclopedias that guided society and were the primary historians. But once their roles were usurped by the printing press and they could easily distribute, this knowledge, they kind of were devalued. And then when the Industrial Revolution came about, before that, we were very agricultural. And who owned the farms? It was the wealthy, really wealthy white men who owned all the farms. And so those were sort of the revered members in society. Then when the Industrial Revolution came, the younger people flocked to the cities and into the factories, and older people were seen as not being able to keep up or adapt to the new technology. They also couldn't leave their farms, right, unattended, so they didn't really, many of them weren't able to go to the cities. And so younger workers became sort of the economic drivers, and the major economic power was transferred to them, so they became revered as more worthy and more needed. And so that's kind of where older people lost a lot of their clout, I guess. And somehow in that process, aging became viewed as a deterioration, a weakness, or disadvantage, and caregiving viewed as a burden. So this was a study that included over 3,400 college students in 26 countries. It had participants rate their perceptions of changes in these different domains, so physical, cognitive, and socio-emotional characteristics as older adults aged. So they did find a widespread cross-cultural consensus regarding the directory of aging trajectories. So they looked at these 8 domains: attractiveness, ability to do everyday tasks, ability to learn new things, general knowledge, wisdom, respect received, family authority, and life satisfaction. And there was a cross-cultural census. So what they found is, or what students thought is that as people aged, there tended to be a decrease in attractiveness and ability to do tasks, ability to learn new things, and a small decrease in life satisfaction. Perceptions, these were perceptions. And as people aged, there was a perception, there was increased knowledge, wisdom, respect, family authority. So what they did find also is that Asian cultures tended to have more positive views on aging when you separated out that population answering this survey than their Western counterparts. So I had never really thought of social constructs. I had to look up kind of what that meant and really think about it, but aging is a social construct. Social constructs are concepts that are not really objective realities, but exist because we've agreed upon them and assigned them value. So they're created to help us make sense of the world and really to help us determine how we view others and their behaviors. So for example, money, if you think about what money really is, it's just a piece of paper that's been assigned a value, but it's valuable to us because we've assigned it that value. And countries. So countries really are parcels of land that have been designated as having borders. I mean, most countries don't really have a border. There's not a fence going around every single country. But because we say this part is one country and this part's another country, this part belongs to one group of people, this part belongs to another, then that's a social construct. We constructed that. And age, if you look at it, is also a social construct. We've defined what old and young, are, and this has changed over time. So think about the caveman times, old was probably 35. The Industrial Revolution, old was probably 50. And now, and also across cultures. So old in, sub-Saharan Africa is different than old in Sardinia, which is where the oldest of the old live. But it's all age is what we've defined it to be. So what are some positive aspects in the aging process? Studies show there's improved social and emotional intelligence in older adults. There tends to be a greater acceptance of self and others, and usually less emotional volatility and better understanding of relationships and kind of this, they use wisdom actually to, these lived experiences generate wisdom. And there tends to be more gratitude and resiliency. And older adults who hold positive perspectives on aging report less ageism overall and overall better physical and mental health. There are some people that I take care of more in the clinic setting that will say, as I've aged, I've really mellowed out. I've really become much more adept at dealing with ups and downs. I tend to manage people better. And as I've managed people better, I'm happier. So those are the type of people that will hold positive perspectives on aging because they feel like overall, they're better with age instead of the opposite. So let's look at ageism in the media. Ageism in the media doesn't help us with a positive view on aging. I just pulled some headlines. What's the typical degree of cognitive ability for a person in their 80s? Like what in the world? That's like a whole news headline. Um, this was around the election time. So are Biden and Trump too old to run? This is kind of funny too. Elderly serial slingshot shooter nabbed after terrorizing neighbors for a decade. Special counsel calls Biden a sympathetic, well-meaning elderly man with a poor memory and brings no charges. Mitt Romney has an urgent message for McConnell and Biden and Trump. Our leaders want everyone to accept their age, but they cannot admit they are simply old. So this is our media headline. So it's not really helping with us changing the younger generation into thinking that aging is a positive thing. And also in advertising, think about the greeting card aisle. You would never want to turn another year older if you went down the greeting card aisle and read all the greeting cards. And then when I was younger, they used to have the help billboards on the highway. I haven't really seen any of those lately, but it was help, I've fallen and I can't get up. They also had like commercials, and so when you see those as a kid, you think all old people are falling and they're decrepit in their homes and they can't get up. And then our cosmetic ads. It's really crazy. I have a 13-year-old daughter now, and she and her friends wear sunscreen every day because they don't want to get wrinkles. And they're 13. Like I wasn't thinking about that at 13. And I have to look at her products she's buying because I don't want there to be retinol in them or hyaluronic acid, but she tries to sneak that stuff in because it's, you want to avoid aging at all costs, physically, mentally. So switching gears a little bit, we'll talk about ageism in the workplace, and then we'll finish up with ageism in healthcare. So in 2018, there was this study done by the AARP that showed adults over 50 years of age contributed about 40% of the US gross domestic product. But the economy missed out on an additional $850 billion because of involuntary retirement, unemployment, and underemployment of older adults. So if you look at the graphs on the right, the 50 plus labor workforce has grown by 80% since 1998. And then on the bottom there, over 40% of workers age 65 and older intend to continue working into their 70s. A study of older nurses that I looked at showed that those who perceived ageist practices at work were less likely to identify with the culture at work and were more likely to seek early retirement. So those who felt not valued because of their age would retire early. About 10% of retired men reported they felt that they retired because of age discrimination, and about 7.5% of women. Aging bias in the workforce tends to be easier to mask than biases such as race and gender. There tends to be this pervasive assumption that only younger people are adept with changing technology, and that we do tend to focus our hiring efforts on younger or what we call more fit employees. This actually seems to be ageism in the workplace seems to disproportionately affect lower socioeconomic classes and minority workers. So it's really even more of a problem with our minority workers. So what are some advantages of hiring older adults? They tend to have a strong work ethic. They tend to be loyal to their job. They tend to be more punctual. They have a level of professionalism that's maybe higher than some of our younger generation. They tend to have stronger communication skills and enhanced problem-solving skills, probably because of their vast experiences and their wisdom that they have. So I have a little bit about ageism in the workplace, but we'll switch now to ageism in healthcare. In the 1900s, the biomedical model of aging was created, and this is what was taught in med schools. So this model focuses on the belief that health is the absence of disease and disability, and that we should, as physicians and healthcare providers, focus on curative solutions. So it defines disability as a pathology or impairment or dysfunction, and kind of looks at aging as something to be diagnosed, treated, and cured. This model kind of established our bias that aging is a pathological state, and that's kind of the crux of healthcare, of our models here on aging. So there is a high prevalence of ageism amongst healthcare professionals. There tends to be an overall negative attitude often towards older patients, a desire to focus on curative medicine. We'll talk about this in that when I ask, med students and such, why would you not go into geriatrics? This comes up again and again, like, well, we can't help those people kind of thing. There tends to be a desire to avoid the complexities of evaluating and diagnosing and managing multiple comorbidities. It is challenging, it is time consuming. And there's a belief that pain and suffering are just expected aspects of older age. And our healthcare systems focus on provider efficiency and productivity and reimbursement, and that tends to cause problems when we're seeing older adults because we can't see as many in the same time frame, and it often just it takes much more resources to do the same amount of care as a younger person. But I think there's some evidence of slow cultural change. Again, highlighting that we don't use age alone any longer. I don't think as much in dictating our medical decision making. We know age alone is not a good indicator of health status or ability to recover. So I think we're doing a better job at looking at the whole picture in the person's functional status and other things that indicate someone's ability to recover and their overall health status. So this was a study that looked at physicians in training's attitudes toward older patients, included interviews with 21 medical students and residents that worked at a teaching hospital in California. So I picked out a couple expert excerpts that I will read. It's always a bigger save when you help a 35-year-old woman with 2 kids than it is to bring an altered 89-year-old with a UTI back to her semi-altered state. So from that regard, it's a little bit less rewarding. Later in the interview, he states, it's hard to admit somebody fixed one of their 22 problems, probably their least significant problem, and then send them back. That's not rewarding. Maybe you rehydrate someone who's dehydrated, or you give them some anti-nodules since they're vomiting. You've made them feel better in the moment, but in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't feel like you've done much, so it's frustrating for me. And then here's another one. Eventually, you have to disengage and just leave the room, even if they have 5 other complaints that they want to talk about, like the food wasn't good, the nurse kept waking them up in the middle of the night to take their blood pressure, and they didn't like that, and they think their home medication's a little different from this, in a diminutive voice, acting like he's the patient. They're the little blue ones, a little bigger, they're kind of like this shape. And some, the intern says, I'd like to be able to talk to people all day, but when you have 7 other people to see, you don't care if the little blue pill is this big or shaped or what. A fourth-year student voiced similar frustrations by stating, doctors assume that when an old person comes in, there's going to be a ton of problems, and it's going to be a pain to address all those issues. Responding to a question about whether she received negative messages from her colleagues about nursing home patients, she said, our gut reaction is when you hear a patient's from a nursing home, you cringe a little. It's not that you're speaking negatively about them, it's just that generally they have a lot of medical problems and that's why they're in the nursing home. So while I can't guarantee that it doesn't affect their care, I'm hoping it doesn't, I'd like to think we give good care to everyone. So it's really interesting. The number of board certified geriatricians is decreasing steadily. So in 2000, there was about 10,000 board certified geriatricians, and now we're down to about 7,000. In 2022, about 43% of geriatric fellowship spots were filled. Actually, last year it was like 42%, I believe, when I looked at the fellowship match. So we have the lowest fill rate of all 71 fellowship specialties in geriatrics. Isn't that crazy? The AAMC data shows that the geriatrician salary is about 9% lower than general internist and 14% lower than hospitalist, despite fellowship training. So usually students will tell me, I like geriatrics, but I don't want to go into it because they get paid less. So my training, I did 3 years of internal medicine, and then I did a year of geriatric fellowship. So I've done more training than, someone that's a general internist or someone that's a hospitalist, but I probably get paid less. I don't ask because I probably don't want to know, but that's one of the things that people cite is why they won't go into the specialty. If you look just in comparison, look down at that bottom right graph there. So, geriatricians, there's like 7,000 depending on the year, and pediatricians, 102,000. You got 51,000 OB-GYN and 35,000 cardiologists. So we're just like a little tiny blip in terms of specialty. I calculated in Missouri, we represent less than 1% of the workforce. So I wonder, you ask why. I wonder if it is secondary to some ageism or these biases in us. I think our societal attitudes regarding ageism have contributed to the fall of geriatrics as a specialty and kind of how trainees feel about older people. Like I said, the most commonly cited reason that trainees aren't interested is the salary, but it's also that people want to work with people who can be cured. That's the belief. Do I think that I take care of all these people that never can be cured? No, of course not. But that's sort of just the misperception. And I see it, I work in the hospital. Sometimes I do like 1 week of consults every other month. And the geriatric consult service has the highest resident call-in rate. Like I really think oftentimes people think it's a joke or not helpful. One time this guy called in because he called in for days because he said his cat was sick and he needed to take his cat to get an echo. And I just think like this guy would not have called the cardiology attending and said the same thing, or the ICU attending. There tends to be competing priorities when building aging-friendly healthcare systems. I think I have another lecture on aging-friendly healthcare systems, but that's one of our tasks as geriatricians is to try to work on this. And it's really hard for me to get what I want done in the healthcare system, especially in the hospital. And it's very frustrating. We used to have a geriatric floor. We can't seem to establish that now since COVID. I can't get any traction on that. We can't really seem to hire dedicated people who just want to do geriatrics in terms of nursing because it's too hard. I found this. There's a geriatrician and author, Louise Aronson. She writes that when I tell someone what I do for a living, they usually have one of 2 reactions. Either their face contorts as if they've smelled something foul, or they offer compliments about my selflessness or my selfless dedication. These apparently opposite responses are actually one and the same. Both imply that what I'm doing is something no one in their right mind would ever do. And I remember this, the first time I really had an experience with this, I was probably in practice for like 1 year or 2 years maybe. And I had clinic at this private hospital. We would go out to DePere Hospital and do clinic. And I ran into the surgeon in the doctor's lounge, and I didn't know a lot of people there. So I introduced myself to him, and he told me what he did. He asked what I do. And I said, well, I'm a geriatrician, but I do a lot of nursing home work. It's kind of my favorite part of the week. And he looked at me and he said, really? I thought only doctors that couldn't get jobs worked in nursing homes. And it was the first time it occurred to me that what I did was maybe not valued by everyone, and that here I thought, nursing home work is my favorite. It's so much fun. I love doing this. And, I didn't realize there was a stigma that I only am doing it because I can't get a job somewhere else. So then he proceeded to tell me, oh, well, that's great that you do that. Here's my card. If any of your nursing home patients ever need surgery, I'd be happy to take care of them. And I just couldn't get to the trash can quick enough to rip it up. I was like, what in the world? But it was really the first time I thought about, and since then I've seen it happen many times where people are like, you work in a nursing home? Like, why would you do that? Um, so how do we change the narrative? I guess that's the next part, right? There's no easy way because these are deeply rooted and normalized beliefs. I think we really have to identify biases in ourselves before they can be overcome. One of the ways is we have to view others through the eyes of equity, aiming to treat everyone the same and respect all, despite age. Consider the contributions one made across a lifespan to their work, family, and community. I do this a lot in the nursing home because a lot of times by the time patients get there, they're not able to tell me what they did in their life. So I just always imagine like this is, this person who has advanced dementia now was once a like thriving member in the community. Who knows, they probably had an awesome job, they had kids, they, had a whole life. So you kind of have to look at them, not just the moment they are at now, but look at the contributions they made across their lifespan. I think we have to train the interdisciplinary team on how to identify ageism and then really promote teams that encompass age diversity in healthcare and workplace settings so that people of all ages can work together and learn together. We know that biases are challenged when people connect with each other on an authentic level and develop genuine relationships. I think that's how my grandparents and I had really good relationships. So I think that challenged a lot of the biases I could have had. And then we have to learn to embrace the heterogeneous nature and complexity of aging and seeing really the beauty in the natural process and see our profession as one of service. We're here to serve others. It doesn't matter, where they're at in their life, we're here to serve them. And then focus on developing aging-friendly healthcare systems so that our older adults receive really the best comprehensive care possible. We want to reduce the harm the healthcare system causes them and promote satisfaction in the care they're receiving. And then this is probably the hardest one. How do we change the media's representation of older adults in the aging process? Because I think once that changes, then a lot of other things will fall into place. So this last study that we'll talk about was a meta-analysis that looked at like what can reduce ageism. So it included 63 studies with over 6,000 participants. And found that interventions that focused on education and intergenerational contact showed the largest effects on participants' attitudes towards aging. And these effects tended to be stronger for females and also for the younger age groups. So again, what are the benefits of intergenerational practice? We know it decreases ageism. There tends to be better physical health for all parties involved, better mental health, stronger social connections. We can develop new skills and just improved overall well-being. So we'll finish off with it's possible to age successfully. So I asked a couple of my patients that I see in clinic if I could include their stories because they're successful agers. It's funny, one of them I just saw a little bit ago, actually, Dr. Sandy Johnson came in today, but I included her and her husband. They're both lawyers, and Dr. Sandy Johnson worked in the law school actually and was the dean of the law school for a time. And what they wanted me to say is that they're still active, they're still writing textbooks, they're in their mid-70s now. And Mr. Johnson actually has multiple sclerosis and has a lot of other health issues, but still is very sharp and doesn't let his physical limitations keep him from doing what he wants to do. Then we've got Dr. Paul and Mrs. Lowenstein. Mrs. Lowenstein was a MICU nurse manager at Washington University for most of her career. Dr. Paul Lowenstein works at SLU. He's a virologist and immunologist on the college campus. And what he wanted me to share is that even though Mrs. Lowenstein has physical limitations and she's also has dementia, she enjoys traveling. So they do have financial resources, but they've made it possible, to still tour India. They went on an African safari and an Indian safari. And, it's possible you can put, if you have the resources to do it, even though there's limitations, you can still, be successful in what you want to do. And then last couple that I both take care of both of them, Dr. Karen Barney, she was an occupational therapist and the chair of occupational therapy at SLU. And then Mr. Steve Barney, her husband, worked in the corporate world at SSM. And what she wanted me to share is while she was very successful in her career, after she retired, she put efforts in a new project. They adopted several children, and one of their children has been long-term in prison. And she developed this prison decarceration program for people who get out of prison after being in prison for a while. They're not adept to, the changes in society. So they developed this whole little training course because she said she was seeing people get out of prison and they hadn't even, seen ATMs or, knew how to use the internet right and knew how to go get a job. So she developed this whole program for people that were able to get into the real world again. And I think to become anti-ageist, we have to begin with the concept that aging itself is not the problem and that old people are not a burden, and see instead the vibrancy and richness in the aging experience. And sort of our take-home points today, age is a construct that's created by and agreed upon by society and cultures. Cultures view aging very differently. Western cultures tend to have less positive perspectives. Ageism is highly prevalent in the media, workplace, and healthcare settings. And the key to changing the narrative is identifying biases on an individual and structural level and working to change the culture. So just one last reminder, aging is not something that's just happening to older people. You are aging. That's my mom, and she was able to go on hikes with us in Sedona on spring break. She's not really that old though, but I will stop sharing my screen and take any questions.
If anyone has any questions, you are welcome to unmute and ask them, or you can type them in the chat. And also just one more reminder to complete the form that's listed in the chat. The link is there for the form that needs completed by every attendee. Anyone have questions?
Well, thank you everyone for your attention.
Thank you. It was a great lecture. Thank you for taking time out of your day to present to us. We appreciate it.
No problem.